As the Sudan war enters its fourth year, an MEE investigation shines light on why it's still happening. Ethiopia is covertly supporting Sudan's paramilitary Rapid Support Forces, or RSF, from a national army base near the western city of Asosa. This is despite Ethiopia's Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, pictured here with Sudan's leader, claiming neutrality in the war. And it's part of a wider web of international collusion in lucrative illegal trades through Sudan that have displaced millions and protracted the biggest humanitarian crisis in the world. The Sudan war is a people's revolution hijacked and a civil feud compounded by extraterritorial interests, money, geopolitics, ethnic hate. Fought officially between Abdel Fattah al-Burhan of the Sudanese Armed Forces, or SAF, and RSF leader Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, known as Hemeti. But the list of unofficial international actors is long. From the UAE to the EU, trading weapons or people or gold, the dark money flows right to your doorstep. Regional tensions are escalating. In early March, Sudan's military government openly accused Ethiopia of involvement and warned Addis Ababa of undefined consequences. Oscar Rickett is one of two MEE journalists who broke the story. He's with me in the studio. Oscar, your report was based on satellite analysis by Yale School of Public Health's Humanitarian Research Lab, and this showed suspicious activity at this military base dating back to at least November. Exactly what kind of suspicious activity are we talking about?
Yeah, so hi, Mathilda. We had been working with Yale's HRL for a few months because I think probably in October or November, I started to hear from sources about the possibility of an RSF training camp in the Benishangul Gumuz region of Western Ethiopia. It's a war-torn place anyway. There's a large number of refugees from there, internally displaced people. It's also crucially very near the Sudanese borders, near the Blue Nile state. What then happened was that in February, Reuters reported the existence of what they claimed to be a base close to a mining site in the Menge district of Benishangul Gumuz. We were not sure about that, and then Yale and Middle East Eye were able to pinpoint the existence of assistance to the RSF at an Ethiopian National Army base in Asosa, which is the capital of Benishangul Gumuz. The base itself is on the outskirts of Asosa, and it's not a training camp. It's an Ethiopian army base. But what we saw through satellite imagery, but also from remote sensing data and from ground sources, was the transfer of large number of technical vehicles into the base at Asosa. They then go out and they are seen in footage of fighting in Sudan's Blue Nile state. You also see in the satellite imagery the retrofitting of vehicles to turn them into APCs. So you put machine guns on them, basically. None of these vehicles, by the way, are consistent with anything the Ethiopian army has. They're consistent with what the RSF has. We could also see through videos online and through other sources, the passage of some of these vehicles and car carriers from Berbera, the port on the Somali coast that hosts or did host until relatively recently an Emirati base. And of course, the United Arab Emirates is the primary patron of the RSF, though it continues to deny it. The other things that we saw in the satellite imagery, we saw Connex containers turning up. We saw the disbursement of supplies. We saw the installation of tents. And all of these things were consistent with support for the RSF. We would then see, the vehicles for people, as I've said, we would see them turning up in fighting in Blue Nile. And the RSF and its allied forces have made significant grounds in Blue Nile state over the last few months, and they've done this with they've invaded from Ethiopia, from Ethiopian territory, and they have, we would say, and I think that our evidence is incontrovertible, and neither the RSF nor the UAE nor the Ethiopian army have denied it. It's happened with great help from this base in Asosa.
But in the past, Ethiopia has said that it maintains neutrality in the war on Sudan. So why would Ethiopia be helping the RSF?
Well, Ethiopia says, and it has good evidence, that the Sudanese armed forces supports rebels in Tigray, and that we believe to be true. That has been happening for a long time. There's a historic, or not historic, but there's a dispute between Ethiopia and Sudan about the Al Fashaga region, which is potentially a very fertile area. It's in dispute between Sudan and Ethiopia. Sudan has supported rebels in Tigray, so that's one thing that's happening. The Ethiopians, again, what they would point to is the involvement of basically every other country in the region in this war. Abiy is our Ethiopian sources, including people who advised for the foreign ministry, including army generals, they have described an Ethiopian foreign policy under Abiy, who let us not forget, won a Nobel Peace Prize shortly after he became the country's leader. A policy that is very tied to the UAE. They really are strongly tied to the UAE, and they are in conflict. They have been in conflict for a long time with Eritrea, their neighbor, which Ethiopia is landlocked, Eritrea is not. And Ethiopia has long sought a passage to the sea, and it is believed that, I was told by a source who had advised the Ethiopian government, that last year the UAE and the Ethiopians were planning to invade the Eritrean port of Asab, but then they pulled back from that idea. Now that would be beneficial to both Ethiopia and to the UAE, which looks to control maritime routes in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, something that has become increasingly relevant with the war in Iran. But it's to give the Ethiopians their due. They're also there's also a struggle between them and Egypt. Egypt supports the Sudanese armed forces as well, and we believe the Egyptian military is present in the Sudanese war, not just in the north, but in the area that we're talking about as well.
Okay, but the UAE is quite key here, because the supply line that you've identified coming through separatist areas of Somalia and into Ethiopia and then into Sudan to the RSF, this supply line begins in the UAE. How extensive is UAE influence in Ethiopia? And perhaps you could tell us also why the UAE appears to be so invested, although they deny it, in supporting the RSF.
Well, so the Emirati Foreign Ministry doesn't reply to me, but they have denied allegations that have come up from our investigations before. But as I think we'll see in this segment, there have been various tacit admissions of involvement from Emirati officials, but also at the end of the Biden administration, the Americans were saying that the UAE would stop its support for the RSF, which again was itself a tacit admission of what was going on. Why does the UAE care about the RSF? Why does it care about Ethiopia? I think so. I mentioned Berbera, I mentioned Bosaso. These are two ports in the Somaliland and Puntland regions of Somalia. They are two breakaway regions of Somalia. They're looking to split off from the central government in Mogadishu. And Somaliland is particularly key because Somaliland, first of all, it is its sort of own historic entity. It has historically, been its own sort of part of that region, but been its own part of Somalia. It has received a great deal of support from the UAE, also from Britain, which is the former colonial power there. And it's now, of course, over Christmas, Israel became the first country in the world to formally recognize the sovereignty of Somaliland. And it has done that because of its relationship with the UAE, but also because Israel wants its own base on the Red Sea, partly to counter the Houthis, partly to counter other Iranian, interests. So there's this kind of like geopolitical web that we are seeing here, right? And the support for the RSF is part of that. Now, the RSF was part of the Sudanese state, grew out of the Janjaweed militias that committed genocide in Darfur in the first decade of the 21st century. The RSF becomes officially part of the Sudanese state in 2013 under Omar al-Bashir. But then Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, Hemeti, he and Burhan are the two military leaders who officially removed Bashir from power in 2019 in the wake of the Sudanese revolution. In 2021, the two men together enact a military coup that ends any kind of civilian government in Sudan. And then, 3 years ago, April 2023, the two men turn on each other. They always had different sources of wealth, power, etc. Before they started fighting each other. They had a common enemy, which was the people of Sudan, essentially. And then they turned on each other, and they've been fighting ever since. Hemeti has a long-standing relationship with the UAE. When the Sudanese sent fighters to Yemen for the Saudi UAE coalition there, they mainly came from the RSF, 40,000 Sudanese. Most of them were from the RSF. Gold flows out of RSF-controlled territory, also out of SAF-controlled territory, but out of RSF-controlled territory over to Dubai, to the gold market in Dubai, to Abu Dhabi. Hemeti, we know, owns property entities connected to Hemeti own property in Dubai. Before the war started, Hemeti spent a week and a half in the UAE. So there's this long-standing, well-established relationship between the two. Apart from the kind of thing that I've been talking about today in Ethiopia, we have, weapons shipments, we have flight tracking data. We can see these flights flying in from Abu Dhabi. And Ethiopia has become much more important for the UAE because in January, in the wake of Israel's recognition of Somaliland, in the wake of all these allegations about what the UAE was doing at Bosasa and at Berbera, Somalia, the government of Somalia in Mogadishu, said, no more, we're cancelling our contracts with you. And so the UAE has had to look, at least partly, to move and shift some of its supply lines. But as far as we can see, it's still going. They're still flying things to Ethiopia. They're still flying things to Chad. They're still being helped by Khalifa Haftar, the Eastern Libyan commander, even despite the war on Iran putting real pressure on them at home.
Oscar Rickett, thank you so much for taking us through those details.
Thank you, Mathilda.
Now, the RSF, the office of the Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, and the Ethiopian Foreign Ministry did not respond to MEE's request for comment. The UAE also denies direct support of the RSF. But starker than denials of involvement are denials of attention, aid, and efforts by the international community to resolve the conflict. This was voiced with desperation by the UN Humanitarian Coordinator in Sudan in an appeal given a few days before Wednesday's 3-year anniversary.
The question is, why isn't the world outraged enough to do something about it? It's what has to happen more? What more has to happen for everyone to sit up and pay attention to find a solution?
So here's a window into what survivors of the Sudan war have endured.
المهم ما في مويه وما في حتات دكان وما في حتات حاجة وبيعملنا يعني حاجة كده نتناولها يعني، وما في حتات موية كده. مشينا طبعا نفتش في الغابات عشان نباس لنا حتات موية. مشينا لقينا لنا حفرة كده، المهم الحفرة دي بيشربوا منها البهايم، بيشربوا منها الناس، يعني الناس بتاعنا الرعاية بتاعت الغنم دي. المهم قمنا شلنا منها موية وشربنا.
The rapid support forces beat and humiliated us. They took all that we had and left us with nothing. I can't find my husband. I don't know if he is dead or alive or where he is.
Sexual violence is being used as a tool to terrorize not only the women but whole communities. As we talk, this is still happening.
They said to women, and this have been the statement taken from a lot of survivors there, they have been accusing them of being less people, like calling them slaves and saying that when I'm attacking you, assaulting you sexually, I'm actually honoring you.
These people have collected 300 of us, civilians, travelers. They brought us to a reservoir. There was a young man I studied with in university. He told them, don't kill him. After that, they killed the rest of the people.
سبحان الله في الطريق مخيف. الحاجة اللي خلاه تكون مخيف شنو؟ لأنه بتلقى جثث واقف، جثث بتاعت ناس، جثث بتاعت أطفال، ملابس بتاعت ناس متقولات، مستندات بتاعت ناس متقولة في الشارع. يعني الشارع والله تقدر تقول زي الأفلام المخيفة دي، يعني أفلام بتاعت رعب.
Sudan Updates is a digital platform that collates content from and on Sudan in a bid to keep it under the media spotlight. It was founded by Sudanese activist Ameen Mekki, who joins us now. Ameen, welcome back to the show. Now, what many people may not realise about the war in Sudan is that it began as a people's revolution. In 2019, after years of rebellions, civil forces that combined workers, students, women, farmers forced the military to oust Omar al-Bashir's authoritarian government. But what began as transitional power sharing between the people and the army was hijacked by a military coup and then descended into today's ruthless power struggle between rival generals and their forces. I mean, have the people's dreams of democracy and revolution survived these 3 years of war?
Hi, Mathilda. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to be back. To answer your question, the answer is I definitely not. I think that the war obviously comes in a larger project of, counter-revolutionary activity that's been, we've seen has started since the signing of that agreement between the civilian and the military actors in Sudan. Since the very beginning, we saw, initially the coup that happened in October 2021, I think was the pinnacle or the climax of those, the counter-revolutionary activity. And I think that, the revolution was essentially a movement that kind of brought people together to kind of dismantle the oppressive systems of exploitation and extraction that had been ruling Sudan. And it was a movement, that the military and, the elites in Sudan obviously wanted to oppress and repress and wanted to fail. And I think that this war comes, as I said before, in that context. And it's just another phase, if you will, of that counter-revolutionary project. A lot of activists and a lot of scholars have pointed to the fact that, the whole part of the idea or part of the justification behind the war is arguably also to, disillusion Sudanese people with this idea of liberation and democratic governance and civilian governance in the country. So I think, but to answer your question, to put it simply, I don't think that Sudanese people have been, disillusioned by this ideal of living in a Sudan that's liberated from these exploitative and extractive systems. And I think a clear example of that is the memorial protest that went out on December 19th to kind of memorialize or celebrate the anniversary of the revolution. We saw a wide range of people that came out to celebrate the revolution and to reaffirm that, we're still here, we're still fighting, and we still have faith in the revolutionary project. And, even after the coup, protesters came out and they said that they know that the revolution is a marathon essentially, and that this isn't just, it's not, it doesn't, the win kind of doesn't come in just a simple or a singular moment, but it's the fact that, the movement, sustaining the movement to kind of continue on in their revolutionary struggle.
Now, we've just been hearing about Ethiopia's covert support for the RSF and more fundamentally the UAE's behind them. But the military supply line doesn't end there. The UAE itself is armed and also reputationally defended and covered for by other international powerful partners. Could you just tell us, which other countries stand out when we're looking at the external forces that continue to serve the counter-revolution in Sudan?
Off the top of my head, I think I can answer this question in kind of two phases. We have that initial group of countries that kind of forced or sidelined revolutionary goals or revolutionary wants, which, initially the revolutionaries didn't want to sign this power sharing agreement and enter into this framework with the military, because essentially it legitimizes the military actors that had perpetrated so many crimes against them. And off the top of my head, I'm thinking of the June 3rd massacre, and as well as, the genocide in Darfur and so many other conflicts that they've been, complicit in. But also another part of this is the fact that countries like the UK, for example, have been providing diplomatic cover for the main suppliers of the RSF, namely the UAE, and as well as the fact that they continue to arm the UAE and sell arms to the UAE, knowing that the UAE then, supplies the RSF with these arms. So it's the fact that, we've seen RSF or weapons possessed by the RSF coming from places like France, from China, from so many other places. And the fact that, that these countries are obviously well aware of that, but they're choosing not to, stop their business relationships with the UAE and profiting off of the war. They're choosing to profit off the war essentially by continuing to sell these arms to the UAE, knowing full well that they are ending up in the RSF. And obviously, in my opinion, it's a violation, obviously, also of the arms embargo that was placed on Sudan, specifically in Darfur. Where the RSF is being allowed to continue these crimes because of the continued supply of weapons through the UAE.
And talk to me also about EU complicity. Something that I didn't realise is that the RSF has previously functioned as an anti-migrant force. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so essentially in the regime of Omar al-Bashir, the RSF was used as a kind of border guard specifically in the north western region that connects Sudan to Libya and along the other borders in that area. And essentially the EU is complicit through setting up the Khartoum process, which was an agreement between the EU and the Sudanese state to essentially fund the Sudanese government to conduct this policy of violence, essentially, to curb migration. So in a sense, the EU also has a hand in legitimizing the RSF, and definitely has a hand in empowering it as well.
And it's not just
the RSF started out. Sorry.
I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I do think that that's very, very striking to know that, during the 2015 so-called European migration crisis, there were these money flows from the EU into the arms of the RSF. But it isn't just what the international community is doing, it's also what they're not doing. For a country 3 times the size of Ukraine and Gaza put together, Sudan gets shockingly little media attention. And we've spoken to you, Ameen, about why this is in the past. To counter that, based on the feeds that you get out of Sudan, could you tell us where you think global media attention should be directed?
I think, obviously, besides the fact that, Sudan is the largest displacement crisis in the world, with over half the population essentially being in dire humanitarian needs. There's 34 million people that are in need of humanitarian aid. There's 14 million of those people are children. And I think that, the world has a duty to kind of combat or alleviate the suffering that's going on in Sudan, partially because, they're complicit in the creation of the suffering. As we've just discussed, there are so many international actors that are complicit in the war in Sudan. There are so many international actors that are complicit in sustaining the war in Sudan through arming the RSF through the UAE, obviously, or through just simply allowing for this to continue. The international community came together before and said never again to genocide, but the Darfur genocide is continuing. We saw that initial, media kind of focus on Darfur in the early 2000s, but it's hypocritical to me that the same violence is being continued today and perpetrated by the same actors, but there's essentially silence. We've seen that, the RSF in a matter of days slaughtered 10 to 15,000 people in places like Al Junaina and in Western Darfur. This is part of the same genocidal process that was initially started in the early 2000s. And this is the same body, even though it's been rebranded as the RSF. This is essentially the Janjaweed. It's the same body.
Yeah, indeed. A UN fact-finding mission recently concluded that the RSF committed genocide when it captured El Fasher in October. That's the capital of North Darfur. MEE has heard shocking, harrowing first-hand reports about the kind of violence that the RSF inflicted there. Another area that we want to spotlight is the community work that is being done, there's such a lifeline for so many people in Sudan, but they are really struggling under a lack of humanitarian aid. Now, charities and human rights groups called on the governments attending the Berlin conference this week to increase support for local response group, and 1.5 million euros were agreed. But almost half of Sudan's life-saving kitchens have closed in the last 6 months. Largely, this is due to Donald Trump slashing US aid in the States, but also aid being diverted due to the war on Iran. Sudan's community kitchens they're based in mosques, communities in there, and they've been so essential to how people survive. This Sudanese Mutual Aid Network was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize in 2024, 2025. Ameen, can you just tell us about the community action that is happening in Sudan to help people survive this 3-year war?
I think the community aspect of this is part of, the larger revolutionary movement in Sudan. And it's built on the fact that, Sudanese people are sick and tired of waiting for the international community to, come and save us, if you will. But it's about taking agency and taking leadership of our own issues and coming together to sustain ourselves and our communities in Sudan. And an important point that I think just illustrates this is the fact that these community kitchens are run by the same groups and activists that ran the resistance committees of the revolution. And to go back to your previous question about why the international community should care about supporting these communities and supporting the grassroots movement in Sudan is also the fact that these are the same movements that carried the revolution in Sudan and fought for democracy and freedom and a people a governance structure that prioritized people over profits. And I think that when looking at the issues of Sudan in general, a lot of these would be solved through supporting the revolution, essentially. And I think that it's so inspiring to see that the fact that these people are coming, people are still in the face of such abhorrent violence and in this face of starvation and illness and disease and the complete collapse of health and government infrastructure in general, that people are still coming together to kind of do what they can and feed themselves and sustain themselves. And I think it tells the world that Sudanese people are some of the most resilient, brave, and just revolutionary people in general, I think.
Ameen Mekki, thank you so much for your time. And to everyone watching, thank you for tuning in. Make sure you're following us on social media at Middle East Eye. You can email MEElive@middleeasteye.net and hit subscribe to keep up with all our coverage. Goodbye.